Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I'll be telling you about discovered mysteries of the Middle Ages. Sit back, close your eyes, and let yourself be carried away by the story. Sleep peacefully, subscribe. Don't forget to leave comment. I imagine standing at the end of a forest so vast and so ancient the trees' limbs themselves seem to breathe. The year is somewhere between 800 and 400. There are no electric lights. There are no paved roads. There is no glass in most windows, no clocks on the walls, no maps that make any sense to modern eyes. And this world, this strange, magnificent world, was producing some of the most complex art, engineering, philosophy, and political thought that human civilization had ever seen. We call this era the Middle Ages. For centuries, we have misunderstood it almost entirely. For generations, historians spoke of the medieval period as a time of ignorance and stagnation. A long pause between the glory of Rome and the brilliance of the Renaissance. They called it the Dark Ages, and that label stuck like mud to a pilgrim's boot. But new archaeological discoveries, recent translations of long-forgotten manuscripts, and modern scientific analysis of medieval sites and artifacts have begun to shatter that picture completely. What emerges in its place is far more astonishing. The Middle Ages were not dark at all. They were dazzling, violent, sophisticated, and deeply strange. The men and women who lived through those centuries wrestled with questions that haunt us about faith, power, death, and the nature of the universe. And they left behind clues, encoded in stone and parchment, in bone and soil, that we are only now beginning to read. This is a documentary in the truest sense, a document of what we are learning right now. A world is far closer to us than we ever imagined. Over the next 4 hours, we will travel across continents and centuries. We will descend into underground chambers and climb cathedral towers. We will sit with monks in their scriptorians and walk beside crusaders on their brutal marches. We'll ask the questions that the medieval world left unanswered, and we will follow the evidence wherever it leads. Some of what you are about to hear will surprise you. Some of it will unsettle you, and some of it will change the way you see not just the Middle Ages, but the civilization you are living in right now. Because the roots of the modern world, its institutions, its crises, its deepest assumptions, are buried in the medieval soil and are still growing. Welcome to the newly discovered mysteries of the Middle Ages. The journey begins now. Chapter 1. The Lost Plague really killed half of Europe. In the year 347, 12 Genoese trading ships docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. The sailors on board were dying. Their skin was black with strange swellings, and green. Blood oozed from sores across their bodies. Many were already dead, slumped over their oars. The port officials ordered the ships out of the harbor immediately, but it was already too late. Whatever was on those ships had come ashore with them. Within 4 years, somewhere between 30 and 60% of the entire population of Europe would be dead. That That is not a rounding error. That is tens of millions of people. Fathers, mothers, children, clergy, merchants, farmers, artists. Gone within a single generation. Cities that had taken since centuries were left half empty. Fields rotted untended. Entire villages simply ceased to exist. We know this catastrophe as Black Death, and for decades we thought we understood it. We believed it was caused by Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague, carried by fleas living on rats. Ships brought the rats. Rats spread the fleas. Fleas bit people. People died. But in recent years, that story has started to crack. Forensic archaeologists excavating mass burial sites across England, France, and Germany have been extracting DNA directly from the teeth of medieval plague victims. The teeth are perfect preservation capsules, sealed, mineralized, and capable of holding genetic material for centuries. And what they have found in those teeth is genuinely unsettling. The genetic signature of Yersinia pestis is indeed present, so that part of the story holds. But scientists have also found something else: evidence of simultaneous infections with other pathogens, viral agents whose exact nature is still being analyzed. More strikingly, they have found the strain of plant's leg response both was strain from strains seen in earlier or later outbreaks. It was faster, more aggressive, and better adapted to human hosts than any plague strain before or since. This has raised a question that no one can yet fully answer. Where did this particular strain come from, and why was it so extraordinarily lethal? Recent research published by teams working with ancient DNA from Central Asian burial sites has pushed the origin story back to the Tian Shan mountain range. In what is now Kyrgyzstan, sometime around 1333 nearly a decade before the Messina ships. Tombstones at a medieval Nestorian Kurian Christian cemetery near Lake Issyk-Kul bear inscriptions noting that the dead died of an unnamed pestilence. The DNA from those graves matches the Black Death strain almost exactly. So the plagued West along the Silk Road, carried by merchants and their animals, moving through Central Asia and into the Crimea, where it jumped onto Genoese ships. But how it moved, why it moved with such speed, and why it was so much deadlier than previous plague events, these questions remain open. Some researchers have proposed that a period of dramatic climate change in the early 14th century weakened human immune systems across the northern hemisphere. Great Famine of 1315 to 1522 had already killed millions before the plague arrived. People were malnourished, exhausted, and immunologically. When the plague hit a population already on its knees, the results were catastrophic beyond anything previously seen. Others have proposed that the Black Death was not one disease but several striking simultaneously. This theory, long considered fringe, has recently gained new credibility. Analysis of historical accounts from different regions of Europe describes symptoms that do not perfectly match bubonic plague. Some victims showed pulmonary symptoms consistent with pneumonic plague, while others showed hemorrhagic patterns suggesting anthrax, typhus, or even a now extinct viral hemorrhagic fever. The mystery deepens when we look at transmission patterns. Bubonic plague, in its classic form, is not efficiently transmitted from person to person without the intermediary of a flea. Yet the Black Death spread through communities with speed and thoroughness that flea transmission alone cannot fully explain. It swept through monasteries where monks lived in isolation from the outside world. It killed nomadic populations with no contact with urban rat populations. It devastated Iceland, an island no native rat population at all. In the Fort Toyhanning Alids, modern epidemiologists running computational models of the Black Death's spread have concluded that the pathogen, whatever it was, must have had some capacity for direct human-to-human transmission that classical bubonic plague does not possess. Whether this was an airborne component, a skin contact component, or something else entirely remains one of the great unresolved questions of medieval history. What we do know is that the survivors were not the same people who had lived before. The Black Death changed European society at every level, economically, politically, culturally, and even genetically. Studies of modern European genomes have found descendants of Black Death survivors carry specific immune variants at significantly higher frequencies than populations that were not exposed. The plague left a mark on the human genome that is still visible 7 centuries later. And then there is the question of where the plague went. After its initial murderous sweep, through 13th and 1350s and 1350s, it returned aground again and again in waves for the next 3 centuries. The Great Plague of London in 16665 was essentially a late medieval phenomenon. Each recurrence killed fewer people than the last, as the surviving population developed greater genetic resistance. But the first wave, the Black Death proper, remains in a category by itself. Something about that particular moment in time, that particular strain, and that particular set of circumstances created a convergence of lethality that humanity has not seen before since. Understands. It is not merely an academic exercise. In a world where new pathogens emerge with disturbing regularity, the Black Death is the closest historical analog we have to a truly civilization-altering pandemic. And we still not fully understand it. Chapter 2:0 The Secret Engineers Medieval Technology that should not exist. Stand inside Notre-Dame de Paris, even in its damaged state following the 2019 fire, and look up. The vaulted ceiling soars 43 meters above the nave floor. Trellums, carved with stirrums, carry the extra restoration, carry the weight of thousands of tons of masonry overhead. The windows, those famous rose windows, are not merely decorative. They are structural elements carefully calibrated to distribute lateral thrust across the building's frame. Every stone in that cathedral is exactly where it needs to be, performing a specific structural function placed there by men who had no calculus, no engineering degrees, and no modern tools whatsoever. How did they do it? This is one of the central mysteries of medieval civilization, and new research is only deepening the puzzle. For a long time, historians assumed that medieval builders worked by intuition and trial and error. That they built things, some of them fall down, and learned gradually through catastrophe. There is some truth to this. Medieval cathedrals did collapse, sometimes dramatically. The chronicles are full of accounts of builders crushed by falling stonework. But the sheer consistency of Gothic engineering, the fact that so many of these structures have stood for 8 or 9 centuries, suggests something more systematic at work. Recent analysis of medieval building documents, particularly the workshop notebooks known as lodge books, has revealed the existence of sophisticated geometric and proportional systems that medieval builders used as their engineering framework. These systems were not written down in mathematical notation, because most master builders could not read or write in the modern sense. Instead, the knowledge was encoded in physical tools, compasses, and set squares, and in geometric procedures that could be passed from master to apprentice through demonstration. One key discovery has been the identification of a system known as ad triangulum, according to the triangle, which medieval builders used to determine the optimal proportions and angles for Gothic arches and buttresses. By constructing specific triangular relationships between key points in a building's design, a master builder could ensure that the forces moving through the structure were properly distributed without ever calculating a single number. The geometry did the engineering. This is not primitive thinking. It is a different kind of thinking. Spatial, relational, embodied practice. And in some ways it is more sophisticated than the purely empirical approach of modern engineering. A master builder who understood ad triangulum had internalized a set of relationships between form and force that allowed him to make reliable predictions about structural behavior. He just expressed those relationships geometrically rather than algebraically. But the mysteries of medieval engineering go beyond cathedral construction. In recent years, archaeologists have been excavating the remains of medieval industrial sites across England, France, Germany, and the Low Countries, and what they have found has forced a significant revision of assumptions about medieval technological capability. Medieval iron production, for example, was far more sophisticated than previously believed. Analysis of iron artifacts from 12th and 13th century England has revealed the use of controlled carburization processes, adding carbon to iron in specific ways to produce steel with precisely calibrated properties. This was not accidental. Medieval blacksmiths understood, through empirical observation, even if not through chemical theory, that different treatments of iron in charcoal fires produced metals with different hardness and flexibility. They were doing materials science without a periodic table. Perhaps most striking is new evidence for medieval water engineering. Excavations at the sites of Cistercian monasteries across Europe were the great monastic engineers of the Middle Ages have revealed hydraulic systems of extraordinary complexity. The Cistercians built dams, sluices, fish ponds, mill races, and underground channels that redirected entire rivers to serve the needs of their communities. At Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire, the hydraulic infrastructure covered hundreds of acres and served every function from milling grain to flushings entirely by precisely engineered water channels. Recent analysis of these systems using LiDAR scanning technology, which can reveal subsurface features invisible to the naked eye, has revealed that the Cistercians were working at a level of hydraulic engineering precision that not matched again in England until the Industrial Revolution. They understood how to calculate flow rates, how to control silting, and how to design channels that maintained consistent water levels across varied terrain, all without any of the mathematical tools that modern engineers use. And then there is the mystery of medieval clocks. We know that mechanical clocks appeared in European monasteries and cathedrals in the late 13th century. The first documented mechanical clock in England was installed at Dunstable in One Prairie in 283. But the question of where the technology came from, who invented it, and how, surprisingly murky. The standard narrative attributes the invention of the mechanical escapement, the key innovation that makes mechanical timekeeping possible, to medieval European craftsmen working independently. But recent scholarship has pointed to possible connections with Islamic and Byzantine clockmaking traditions. Arab engineers, building on Greek foundations, had developed remarkably sophisticated water clocks and anatomical instruments centuries before European mechanical clocks appeared. The channels through which knowledge might have traveled, through translated Arabic manuscripts, through contact with Islamic Spain, through the Crusader states, are real and documented. Whether the specific innovation of the mechanical escapement was independently invented in Europe or adapted from Eastern sources is a question that remains genuinely open. What is not open is the level of precision medieval clockmakers achieved once they started working. Analysis of surviving medieval clockwork mechanisms from the 14th century reveals gear trains cut to tolerances that, for their time, were extraordinarily fine. The craftsmen who made these devices had developed techniques for cutting and fitting metal gears that represent a leading edge of precision manufacturing in the pre-industrial world. The mystery that runs through all of this is the mystery of transmission. How did knowledge move through medieval society? How did Byzantine engineering technique end up embedded in a Cistercian monastery in Yorkshire? How did a geometric proportions system developed in France in the 12th century influence cathedral builders in Germany in the 14th? The medieval world was not as isolated as we once imagined. Moved slowly, partially, imperfectly, but it moved along trade routes and pilgrimage roads, in the luggage of traveling scholars, in the heads of itinerant craftsmen. And some of what it carried was so sophisticated that we are still struggling to fully understand it. Chapter 3: The Hidden Maps. How the medieval saw itself. If you want to understand how a culture thinks about the world, look at its maps. And if you want to understand the medieval world, look at Hereford Mappa Mundi, the largest surviving medieval world map, created around 1300 and still housed, after more than 7 centuries, in Hereford Cathedral in England. At last glance, the Hereford map looks like a wild dream. Jerusalem sits at the center of the world. The continents are arranged in a rough T-shape. Asia at the top, Europe, and Africa below. The surrounding ocean, forming the outside ring of the T's crossbar. Animals real and legendary inhabit the margins. Elephants and headed men, griffins, and the blemmie. People said to live in India who had no heads but wore their faces on their chests. Fee is wildly distorted by modern standards. But here is the thing that modern viewers almost always miss. The Hereford Mappa Mundi is not trying to show you where places are. It is trying to show you what those places mean. It is a theological diagram as much as a geographical one. Jerusalem at the center is not a geographical error. It is a theological statement. The world is organized around its sacred center. East is at the top not because east is up, but because the east is where the Garden of Eden is, where history began and where in medieval Christian thought, sacred time would end. Once you understand this, the medieval map reveals itself as of a profoundly sophisticated document. It is encoding an entire worldview, a cosmology, a theology, a political geography, and a natural history in a single visual field. The dog-headed men at the edges of the world are not ignorance. They are a statement about the relationship between civilization and its boundaries, between the known and the unknown, between the human and the monstrous. Recent digital analysis of the Hereford map have revealed layers of information that had gone unnoticed for centuries. Scholars using multispectral imaging have found traces of original annotations and corrections that were invisible to the naked eye. Evidence that the map went through multiple revisions, that it was a working document rather than a finished artifact. There are also patterns in distribution of place names that suggest the mapmaker working from multiple source traditions as simultaneously, synthesizing Greek, Romang, Arabic, and contemporary European geographical knowledge into a single frame. But the Hereford map is just one example of a much broader medieval cartographic tradition that has only recently been fully appreciated. For decades, historians that medieval maps were essentially useless for practical navigation, that sailors and merchants relied on entirely different documents, called portolan charts, for actual wayfinding. While the elaborate world maps were purely theological exercises, new research has complicated this picture considerably. Portolan charts, those beautiful, precise, not nautical maps with their compass roses and wind lines, turn out to be far older and more mysterious than previously assumed. The earliest surviving portolan charts date to the late 13th century. But the precision of their coastal outlines is so extraordinary that many researchers now believe they must be based on older source materials, possibly going back centuries. Some portolans show coastlines in the Mediterranean with an accuracy that approaches modern satellite measurement, an accuracy that should not have been possible with the astronomical and mathematical tools available to medieval navigators. Where'd that precision come from? One hypothesis, gaining increasing attention, is some medieval portolan charts were compiled from thousands of individual coastal surveys accumulated over centuries of Mediterranean seafaring. That the precision was not achieved by any single cartographic act, but by the slow accumulation of navigational data across generations. This would make them among the earliest examples of what we would now call crowdsourced data collection. Another recent discovery involves an entirely different category of medieval map: the estate map or local survey. For a long time, historians believed that detailed local maps did not appear in Europe until the 16th century. But archaeologists and archivists have now identified dozens of surviving medieval estate maps from England, France, and Germany dating to the 13th and 14th centuries, showing field boundaries, drainage patterns, roads, and settlements in remarkable detail. These maps were practical documents created by landowners and administrators who needed to manage complex agricultural estates. They represent a tradition of local spatial thinking that ran paralleled to and largely independent of the grand cosmological world maps, and they reveal that medieval people, when they had a practical need to understand the layout of their physical environment, were perfectly capable of producing accurate, useful geographical representations. The mystery of medieval mapping, then, is not really a mystery of capability. Medieval cartographers could produce accurate maps when they wanted to. The deeper question is why they so often chose not to, why the dominant tradition of world mapping subordinated geographical accuracy to theological and cosmological meaning. The answer tells us something important about the medieval worldview. In a society where the physical world was understood primarily as a text written by God, where every mountain and river and foreign people carried symbolic meaning within a sacred narrative, making an accurate map was less important than making a meaningful one. The Hereford Mappa Mundi was not wrong about the world. It was right about everything that mattered most to the people. It just cared about different things than we care about. Chapter 4 The Children's Crusade and the Lies We Tell About It. In the summer of 1212, something extraordinary and deeply strange happened in the towns and villages of France and Germany. According to contemporary chronicles, tens of thousands of children, some accounts say as many as 30,000 in each country, left their homes and began marching south the Mediterranean host. They were going, they said, to the Holy Land. They were going to take back Jerusalem. They were going to succeed where the armies of knights had failed, because God would part the sea for them as he had parted it for Moses, and they would walk to the Holy Land on dry ground. The CD, children, did not reach Jerusalem. Many died on the road. Others, according to some accounts, were loaded onto ships by unscrupulous merchants and sold into slavery in North Africa. The Children's Crusade, as it came to be known, is of the most haunting episodes in all of medieval history and one of the most mythologized. The problem is that almost nothing about the standard version of the story is true. Recent historical scholarship has subjected the sources for the Children's Crusade to the most rigorous critical analysis ever applied to this episode. And the results are startling. The contemporary chronicles that describe the events are inconsistent, contradictory, and in some cases demonstrably influenced by legendary and hagiographical traditions rather than direct observation. Several key elements of the story. The charismatic child leader named Stephen of Cloyes, who supposedly started the French movement, merchant ships, the North African slave markets, appear in sources written decades after the events and show so signs embellishment or invention. What seems to have actually happened is significantly different from the legend, and in some ways even stranger. In the summer of 2012, there were indeed mass movements of people in both France and Germany that involved many young participants. But these were not purely children's movements. They were what historians now call popular crusade movements. Spontaneous, leaderless eruptions of religious fervor swept up people of all ages, including many adults and entire families. The chronicler's emphasis on children may reflect the medieval habit of describing any disorderly or naive movement as childlike. Or it may reflect the actual demographic reality that many of the participants were very young. The movement in Germany was led, at least in part, by a young shepherd named Nicholas of Cologne. Contemporary sources are consistent on this point. Nicholas preached that God had revealed to him that the Mediterranean Sea would dry up before a new crusade of the poor, the humble, allowing them to cross to the Holy Land. His followers, who seem to have numbered in the thousands, not the tens of thousands of legend, marched south over the Alps, arriving exhausted and depleted at the Italian port of Genoa. The sea did not dry up. The Genoese refused them passage. The movement collapsed. Some of Nicholas's followers continued south to Pisa, where they reportedly found 2 ships willing to take them. What happened after that is unknown. Other survivors struggled back north over the Alps, where many died of cold and hunger. Nicholas of Cologne disappears from the historical accord entirely. French movement is even more poorly documented. A charismatic young man, possibly named Stephen, possibly from the village of Cloyes-sur-Loire, reportedly carried a letter to King Philip II of France, claiming it had been given to him by Gisque himself in the guise of a poor pilgrim. Philip, who was preoccupied with a military crisis elsewhere, sent Stephen away. What happened to the movement Stephen may or may not have led? Genuinely unclear. What we can say with confidence is that the lurid ending of the traditional story, the slave ships, the North African markets, is almost certainly a later embellishment. No contemporary Arabic sources, which would be expected to mention the arrival of thousands of Christian slaves in North Africa, contain any such reference. The story appears to have been invented or elaborated by later chroniclers who wanted to impose a dramatic moral lesson on events that were, in reality, far murkier and more ambiguous. Why does this matter? Because the Children's Crusade, even in its mythologized form, has served for centuries as a symbol of medieval irrationality, of the cruel exploitation of innocence by religious fervor, of the darkness that lurks beneath crusading ideology. If the story is largely a later construction, then we have to ask what that construction was serving. Why did medieval chroniclers and later historians need this particular narrative? The answer, recent scholars suggest, is that the Children's Crusade story served as a kind of moral safety valve, a way of condemning crusading excess while still maintaining the basic legitimacy of the crusading enterprise. By locating the worst abuses in a movement of naive children led by fraudulent merchants, the critics crusading could express their doubts without directly challenging the institution itself. The children's story, in other words, was never really about the children. It was about the anxieties of adult medieval society regarding a form of religiously sanctioned violence that was growing increasingly difficult to justify. Chapter 5a. That Bernard Lust knows medieval world. In the library of the monastery of Bobbio in northern Italy, in the year and Porthena 93, a monk named Gerbert of Aurillac, who would later become Pope Sylvester, reportedly discovered a manuscript so extraordinary that it changed the direction of his intellectual life. The manuscript contained mathematical and astronomical knowledge that, in the context 10th century Europe, was simply astonishing. It included calculations of planetary movements, a description of the astrolabe, and, most controversially, what appeared to be Arabic numerals. Gerbert brought this knowledge back into the European scholarly world, teaching his students to calculate with a new kind of counting board and in introducing mathematical ideas that his contemporaries found incomprehensible. He was accused of sorcery. He was said to have made a pact with the devil, and the manuscript he had found at Bobbio disappeared, as so many medieval manuscripts did, into the accumulated losses of time. The story of that lost manuscript is a parable for one of the greatest tragedies of the medieval period, the destruction of knowledge. We know that medieval Europe lost an enormous quantity of ancient learning. We know that libraries burned, monasteries were sacked, manuscripts rotted in damp storage rooms. But what we are only beginning to understand, thanks to new technologies and new archival research, is the full scale of what was lost. Multispectral imaging, the same technology used to reveal hidden layers in the Hereford map, has in recent years been applied to a category of medieval manuscripts called palimpsests. A palimpsest is a manuscript that has been scraped clean and reused, the original text removed, or partially removed and a new text written over it. For centuries, the hidden texts under medieval palimpsests were considered inaccessible. The original ink was gone, but it was not entirely gone. The vellum, made from animal skin, retained chemical traces of the original writing even after scraping. And multispectral imaging, by illuminating the vellum with light at different wavelengths and recording the differential fluorescence, can make those chemical traces visible again. The results have extraordinary. The most famous example is the Archimedes palimpsest, a 13th century Byzantine prayer book that turned out to contain, hidden beneath its Christian text, 7 treatises by the ancient Greek mathematician Archimedes, including his method of mechanical theorems, a work that had been completely unknown to modern scholars. The method reveals that Archimedes had developed something very close to the conceptual foundations 2,000 years before Newton and Leibniz. This knowledge was known to some medieval scholars, transmitted in fragmentary form through Arabic translations, but the full original text had been lost. Since the Archimedes discovery, dozens of other palimpsests have been subjected to multispectral analysis, and the results continue to surprise. Hidden beneath medieval religious texts, researchers have found fragments of lost classical works, philosophical texts, mathematical treatises, medical writings that were known only by reputation before their rediscovery. Each recovery raises the same question: how much more is still hidden, waiting to be found? The question of medieval Islamic scholarship adds another dimension to this mystery. For roughly 5 centuries, from approximately 800, 200 and 300, the Islamic world was the global center of scientific and philosophical inquiry. Arab, Persian, and Jewish scholars, working within the Islamic intellectual tradition, preserved, translated, and dramatically extended the scientific knowledge of Greece and Rome. They made foundational contributions to mathematics, astronomy, optics, medicine, chemistry, and philosophy. Much of this scholarship eventually reached medieval Europe through translation centers in Spain and Sicily, particularly the Great Translation movement of the 12th century, when scholars in Toledo translated hundreds of Arabic texts into Latin, making them accessible to European readers for the first time. This translation movement is now recognized as one of the most consequential intellectual events of the medieval period. Without it, the European Renaissance might never have happened. But for every Arabic text that was translated and preserved, many more were not. The destruction of the House of Wisdom in Baghdad by Mongol invaders in 1258. A catastrophe so severe that contemporary accounts describe the Tigris River running black with ink from thousands of thrown manuscripts, wiped out, and an unknown enormous quantity of scholarly work. We know these works existed because they are cited in surviving texts. We know what subjects they covered. We just cannot read them. Recent efforts by scholars working with digitized manuscript collections in Abu Qaeda, Tehran, and other centers of Islamic scholarship have gone to identify surviving manuscripts that have never been catalogued or studied. The collections are enormous. The Topkapi Palace Library alone contains tens of thousands of manuscripts, many unstudied. New discoveries continue to emerge from these archives. A previously unknown medical text attributed to Ibn Sina. A lost astronomical treatise by al-Biruni. A philosophical work that bridges Islamic and Jewish medieval thought in ways that challenge established narratives about relations between the two traditions. And then there is the mystery of the Voynich manuscript, the most famous and most frustrating of all medieval mystery texts. The Voynich manuscript is a vellum codex of approximately 2 lit 40 pages, written in an unknown script and an unknown language, if it is a language at all, and illustrated with bizarre botanical drawings, astronomical charts, bathing figures, and other imagery that defies easy categorization. Carbon dating has placed its creation in the early 15th century. It has been in the possession of various European collectors since at least the 16th century, when Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II reportedly purchased it. And despite centuries of effort by cryptographers, linguists, historians, and amateurs of every description, no one has managed to decode it. Recent computational analyses of the Voynich have produced genuinely tantalizing results. Statistical analysis of the symbol frequencies and distribution patterns shows that the text has the statistical properties in its language. It is not random, and it is not a simple substitution cipher. The text shows patterns of entropy, of information density, that are consistent with actual linguistic content. Something is being communicated. We just have no idea what. Proposals for the manuscript's content have ranged from a pharmacological herbal to an astrological treatise to an alchemical manual. Proposals for its language have included Hebrew, Arabic-influenced Italian, an artificial constructed language, and an indigenous Mesoamerican language brought to Europe by Spanish conquistadors. None of these proposals has achieved consensus. The Voynich manuscript remains, as of this recording, completely undeciphered. A 400-year-old missive from the medieval or early modern world that no one alive can read. Chapter 6. The Medieval Mind. How people, about God, deck, and time. We make a grave mistake when we assume that people in the Middle Ages thought as we do, but with less information. They did not. They inhabited a fundamentally different cognitive world. A world in which the categories we use to separate the religious from the secular, the supernatural from the natural, the symbolic from the literal, did not exist. To understand the medieval world, you have to perform a kind of a mental self-excavation, removing the assumptions about reality that modern education has deposited in your brain, layer by layer, and trying to see through eyes that perceive the world in an entirely different way. Take the question of time. Modern people experience time as a linear flow, a river moving from past through present into future, with the present moment as a knife-edge point moving along that flow. Medieval people experienced time differently. For them, sacred time was not linear but recursive. The events of biblical history, the creation, the fall, the Exodus, the incarnation, the crucifixion, the resurrection, did not merely happen once in the past. They were patterns that repeated and echoed through all of history, manifesting themselves again and again in the events of the present. When a medieval chronicler described a famine or a military victory in terms drawn from the Old Testament, he was not simply using a literary device. He genuinely believed that what was happening in his present moment was some sense session of, or a participation in, the sacred events of Scripture. History rhymed, and it rhymed because was its author, and he repeated his themes. This understanding of time shaped everything: politics, art, theology, personal identity. A medieval king did not merely try to be a good king in general abstract terms. He tried to be a specific king of king. A king in the pattern of David or Solomon, participating in a royal archetype that was itself a reflection of the divine kingship of Christ. When medieval artists painted Christ in Byzantine garments, or depicted the Virgin Mary with features of a contemporary European woman, they were not making errors of historical accuracy. They were expressing the theological truth. These events and persons outside historical time in a sacred present that was eternally accessible. The medieval understanding of death was equally different, our own, and recent scholarship has complicated our picture of it considerably. We have tended to assume that medieval people, confronted with death far more frequently and at far younger ages than modern Westerners, were either stoically resigned to it or terrified of it. The archaeological and documentary record suggests something more nuanced. Analysis of medieval cemetery populations has revealed that medieval people invested enormous resources in terms of time, labor, and material goods in the proper treatment of the dead. The elaborate rituals of medieval death culture, the masses for the dead, the chantry chapels, the elaborate tomb monuments, the books of hours with their meditations on mortality, were not merely expressions of grief or piety. They were practical systems for managing a relationship with the dead that was understood to continue after physical death. The medieval doctrine of purgatory, the idea that most souls after death spend time in a state of purification before entering heaven, is as a theological invention designed to generate income for the church through masses and prayers. And it certainly did generate income, but it also served a profound psychological and social function. Purgatory maintained a relationship between the living and the dead. The prayers and masses that the living offered for their dead relatives were not merely symbolic gestures. They were understood as genuine interventions capable of shortening the time a soul spent in purgatory. The dead needed the living, and the living needed the dead to pray for them in return, to validate their social identities through the prestige of elaborate funerals, to provide models of holiness or warning examples of sinfulness for those who came after. This understanding of death as a relationship rather than a terminus had profound consequences for medieval social organization. Monasteries and churches derived enormous portions of their income and property from bequests made in exchange for prayers for the dead. An economic system rooted in a theology of spiritual reciprocity between this world and the next. The great medieval hospitals, schools, and charitable foundations were frequently and by wealthy donors who expected to receive spiritual benefit from the goods performed in their name after their death. Medieval charity was not merely altruistic, it was an investment in eschatological insurance. The medieval understanding of the natural world also differs from ours in ways that are difficult to fully grasp. Modern science operates on the premise that the natural world follows laws that are, in principle, invariant, that the same causes produce the same effects everywhere, at all times, and that supernatural intervention into natural processes does not occur. Medieval natural philosophy operated on no such premise. For medieval scholars, the natural world was saturated with meaning and purpose. Every natural phenomenon, the migration of birds, the growth of plants, the behavior of animals, carried symbolic significance that was written into it by its creator. The study of nature was therefore a form of theology, an attempt to read the divine text embedded in creation. Medieval encyclopedists like Isidore of L. and later Albertus Magnus did not merely describe natural phenomena, they interpreted them, explaining what the lion symbolizes in relation to Christ, what the pelican feeding its young from its own blood reveals about divine love, what the behavior of the phoenix teaches about resurrection. This does not mean that medieval people could not observe the natural world accurately. Did. Medieval manuals show careful empirical observation of plant growth, soil conditions, and weather patterns. Medieval physicians accumulated detailed clinical observations of disease symptoms and treatment outcomes. Medieval falconers possessed encyclopedic knowledge of bird behavior accumulated through long practical experience. The difference is that medieval empirical observation was always embedded within a larger framework of symbolic meaning that gave it significance. An observation it only fully made sense when it could be connected to the divine order of which it was a part. This framework shaped what medieval people paid attention to, what they wrote down, and what they considered important. It produced a distinctive kind of knowledge, richer in some ways than modern scientific knowledge, because it was always embedded in questions of meaning and value, but limited in other ways by its subordination of empirical observation to symbolic interpretation. Chapter 7. The Knights Templar, History, MYTH, and the Truth Beneath. Few medieval institutions has been more written in about and misunderstood than the Knights Templar, founded in Jerusalem around 1119 to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. The order of the poor fellow soldiers of Christ of the Temple of Solomon grew, within a century, into one of the most powerful organizations in the medieval world. A supranational military corporation with properties across Europe and the Middle East. A sophisticated financial network that operated the medieval world's most advanced banking. King Philip IV of France had every Templar in his kingdom arrested simultaneously at dawn, under torture. The knights confessed to an astonishing list of crimes, denying Christ during their initiation rituals, spitting on the cross, engaging in obscene kisses, and worshipping a mysterious idol called Baphomet. Within 7 years, the order was formally dissolved by Pope Clement V, and the last Grand Master de Molay was burned at the stake in Paris. The Templar suppression has generated more conspiracy theories than any other event in medieval history. Every generation produces new books claiming that the Templars discovered something. The Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, the secret bloodline of Jesus. And this discovery was the real reason for their destruction. These theories are, without exception, nonsense. But they are interesting nonsense because they point toward a real mystery. The real mystery of the Templar suppression is not what the Templars discovered, it is what really happened during those mass arrests and interrogations, and why a French king and a compliant pope were willing to destroy the most celebrated military order in Christendom. Recent scholarship has provided substantially clearer esquins than were previously available. The Templar confessions, which for centuries were treated as evidence of actual whole heretical practice, are now understood almost universally by historians as artifacts judicial torture. The specific charges, particularly the denial of Christ during initiation, appear in an almost identical form in earlier accusations against other groups, suggesting that the inquisitors were working from a template of heresy accusations rather than documenting actual behavior. The real reasons for the Templar suppression were almost entirely political and financial. Philip IV of France was deeply indebted to the Templars, who had been serving as his bankers. He was also determined to consolidate royal authority in France, and eliminate institutions that operated outside royal control. The Templars, with their papal immunity, their vast properties, and their heavily armed membership, represented exactly the kind of power that Philip could not tolerate. The heresy charges were a pretext, a legally necessary fiction that allowed Philip to seize Templar property and eliminate the order without simply committing re-regre. What is less well understood is what happened to the Templars who were not in France, in England, Scotland, Portugal, Spain, Germany, and Cyprus. Templar trials produced far fewer confessions and far less evidence of the heretical practices that French inquisitors had documented. In Portugal, the order was simply reconstituted under a new name, the Order of Christ, and continued operating under royal patronage. The contrast between the French experience and the rest of Europe strongly suggests that the French confessions were products of the specific methods used by Philip's inquisitors rather than reflections of any actual Templar practices. The question of Baphomet, the idol the Templars were accused of worshipping, is particularly interesting. No physical Baphomet has ever been found. No description of it is instant across different Templar confessions, suggestions, saying that it was invented under torture rather than remembered from experience. The name itself is likely a corruption of Muhammad. Mohammed, a name that French popular prejudice associated with idol worship. The Baphomet of later legend, the goat-headed figure that became associated with Satanism in 19th century, was an entirely post-medieval invention created by the French occultist and Eliphas Lévy in 1856 and entirely disconnected from an actual medieval Templar practice. What recently emerged from archival research is a more nuanced picture of what the Templars actually did beyond their military and banking functions. A Vatican document discovered in the Archivio Segreto Vaticano in Milan in 2001 and published as the Chinon Parchment reveals that Pope Clement V, in a secret tribute held 1808, actually absolved the Templar leadership of the charges of heresy. Clement found the Templars guilty of nothing more than certain improper, undignified practices in their initiation rituals. Practices that he attributed to human weakness, rather other than heretical intent. In other words, the Pope privately knew that the Templars were not heretics. He dissolved the order anyway, under overwhelming political pressure from Philip of France, effectively allowing judicial murder on a massive scale for reasons of political convenience. The Chinon Parchment suggests that Clement was not a willing partner in Philip's but a captive pope, trapped between his spiritual obligations and his political impossibilities. The fate of the Templar archives, the records of their vast properties, their financial operations, and their internal administration, remains genuinely mysterious. Some Templar records were transferred to the Hospitallers, who absorbed much of the Templar property. Others were seized by Philip, but there are significant gaps that have never been explained. Historians working in English and Vatican archives continue to find fragmentary Templar documents in unexpected places, suggesting that the archival record has never been fully reconstructed. Whether these fragments will eventually resolve remaining questions about the order's actual practices and the full circumstances of its suppression remains to be seen. Chapter 8. Women of the Middle Ages. The hidden power behind the throne. The Middle Ages has a reputation as a time of relentless patriarchy. A world in which women were confined to convents or childbirth, their voices suppressed, their abilities ignored, their contributions erased. This reputation is not entirely wrong. Medieval society was deeply patriarchal by any reasonable definition. Women were legally subordinate to their fathers, then to their husbands. They were excluded from most public offices, from the universities, from the priesthood. The theological tradition they lived within had, for centuries, elaborated arguments for their intellectual and molecule inferiority. And yet, the actual historical record, when examined closely, reveals a picture of medieval women that is vastly more complex, more powerful, and more active than the stereotype allows. Consider Eleanor of Aquitaine, who lived from approximately 1122 to 1 Tour to 144, a lifespan of 80 years that spanned one of the most turbulent periods in medieval European history. Eleanor was successively the Queen of France, the Queen of England, the mother of 2 kings of England, and one of the most powerful political actors of her age. She organized and participated in the Second Crusade. She managed the English kingdom as a regent during Richard's captivity. She led a rebellion against her own husband, Henry II. She controlled the Duchy of Aquitaine, one of the largest territories in France. As an independent political actor for much of her life, Eleanor is exceptional, but she is not unique. New research into medieval women's lives has revealed in certain domains, particularly in the economic sphere and in certain religious contexts, medieval women exercised authority and agency that has been systematically underestimated. Medieval noblewomen frequently managed large estates in their husband's absence, which, given the frequency of crusades, wars, and other military campaigns, meant that they effectively ran significant territorial units for extended periods. The administrative records of some medieval estates show women making decisions about land use, judicial proceedings, and financial management that were fully equivalent in scope to what their husbands did when present. In urban commercial contexts, women's economic participation was substantial. Guild records from English and French medieval towns show women working as brewers, bakers, textile workers, traders, and money changers. The English legal category of the feme sole, a woman who operated independently of her husband in commercial matters, gave urban women a recognized economic identity that could, in practice, translate into significant autonomy. The religious sphere offered medieval women perhaps their greatest opportunities for independent action and intellectual expression. The abbess of a major monastic house was a powerful figure, controlling property, directing the spiritual and administrative life of a large community, and sometimes exercising authority over both women and men in affiliated institutions. Women like Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess, composer, naturalist, theologian, and visionary, achieved intellectual and spiritual reputations that transcended gender in a way that was unusual for the period. Hildegard's case is particularly instructive for what it reveals about the mechanisms through which medieval women could exercise intellectual authority. Her access to the public sphere of theological discourse depended entirely on her claims to divine inspiration. She wrote not as a woman thinking, but as a vessel through which God spoke. This framework was simultaneously limiting and empowering. It limited what a woman could say, because she had to present her ideas divine revelation rather than personal reasoning. but it gave her authority that no amount of personal expertise could have provided. Because in the medieval framework, divine authority, all human hierarchies, including gender, recent scholarship has also recovered many women's voices that were previously invisible because they had been attributed to men. The process of attributing medieval texts to their actual authors is ongoing, and as it proceeds, the roster of women writers, thinkers, and scholars in the medieval period grows longer. Letters, medical texts, devotional writings, hagiographies, and even theological works that were long assigned to male authors are being reassigned to women on the basis of eventual evidence, scribal attributions, and archival research. The story of Christine de Pizan, the Italian-born poet and who worked in the French court in the early 15th century, illustrates both the possibilities, essays, and the limits available to medieval women of exceptional ability. After the death of her husband left her with 3 children and no income, Christine began writing to support herself, becoming, in the process, one of the first professional women writers in European history. Her works, including the Book of the City of Ladies, offer a remarkable systematic defense of women's intellectual and moral capacity. Arguing from historical and theological evidence against the misogynist traditions she encountered throughout her career, Christine's work reminds us that medieval women were not merely passive recipients of the patriarchal culture around them. They argued back. They created counter-narratives. They found ways to claim authority and exercise agency within systems designed to deny both. The full recovery of their voices and their contributions is one of the most important ongoing projects in medieval historical scholarship. Chapter 9: The Mongol Storm. The world that might have been. In April Yun, a Mongol army under the command of Batu Khan and his general Subutai destroyed a combined army of Polish and German knights at the Battle of Legnica in Silesia. The same day, a separate Mongol force annihilated the Hungarian army at the Battle of Mohi on the Suzhou River. Within weeks, the Mongols were raiding as far west as Vienna. There was nothing between them and the rest of Western Europe. The great cities, England and the Holy Roman Empire, were completely undefended. And then the Mongols, they turned around and went back east. This is one of the most consequential non-events in medieval history, and historians have been arguing about it ever since. Why did the Mongols withdraw? The traditional explanation is the death of the great Khan Orjadeh in December 241, which required the Mongol princes to return to Mongolia to participate in the selection of a successor. This is true as far as it goes. Orjadeh did die, and the Mongol commanders did eventually withdraw east. But recent scholarship has suggested the death of the great Khan, not the only, or even the primary, factor. Analysis of historical climate records for Central and Eastern Europe in the winter and spring of 141 and 222 revealed that the region experienced unusually warm and wet conditions, precisely the period when the Mongols were conducting their campaign. The vast Hungarian plain, which in normal winters would have been frozen solid, ideal terrain for Mongol cavalry, was instead a swampy morass in early 1942. Mongol logistics depended on the ability to move vast herds of horses across frozen ground. In muddy, flooded conditions, those logistics broke down. Additionally, the Mongols had pushed their supply lines to the absolute breaking point. They had been campaigning continuously for 2 years through Poland and Hungary with extraordinary speed, but also consumed resources at an unsustainable rate. Subutai's intelligence network had identified Western Europe as a wealthy target, but the actual experience of campaigning in that terrain, with its forests and fortified cities and castle networks, had revealed that conquering it would require a far more substantial commitment than the Eastern steppe pains. The withdrawal from Hungary and Poland in 142 was therefore less a gift to Western Europe than a strategic calculation. The Mongols decided, on the basis of military and logistical realities, that the conquest of Western Europe was not worth the cost at that particular moment. They left with the intention of returning. They never did, not because they no longer wanted to, but because the internal politics of the Mongol Empire and eventually the devastating blow of the Black Death prevented it. The question of what Western Europe might have looked like under Mongol domination is one that historians approach with fascination and some difficulty. The Mongols were not simply destroyers, as the popular image suggests. In the territories Kurd, China, Persia, Central Asia, the Mongol Empire eventually created a period of relative peace and commercial exchange known as the Pax Mongolica, which enabled trade and cultural exchange across the entire Eurasian landmass on a scale previously impossible. The Silk Road functioned at its peak during the century of Mongol dominance. But the conquest was spectacularly violent. Cities that resisted were destroyed. Populations that fought back were massacred. The death toll from the Mongol conquests of the 13th century is genuinely difficult to estimate. It was enormous. Some demographers argue that the population of China and Central Asia fell by as much as 40% during the period of Mongol conquest. Whether similar devastation had visited Western Europe, or whether the Mongols have eventually settled into a more administrative role as they did in China, as they did in Persia, and Persia is unknowable. That the near miss of 142 or 42 had profound effects on the European consciousness. The Mongols, called Tartars by Europeans after a Latin pun connecting them to the underworld, Tartarus, entered the European imagination as the ultimate embodiment of apocalyptic terror. Contemporary chronicles describe scenes of horror from the Mongol advance that color all subsequent European thinking about the threats from the East. The political and cultural consequences of this trauma shaped European diplomacy, military organization, and popular anxiety for generations, and it gave rise to one of the medieval world's most extraordinary diplomatic missions. In 1245, Pope Innocent IV Pope Innocent sent the Franciscan friar John of Plano Carpini on a journey to court of the Mongol Great Khan, carrying letters that asked the Mongols to stock in Christians and consider converting to Christianity. John traveled for over a year, covering thousands of miles on horseback, to arrive at the newly elected Great Khan Guyuk's court in Mongolia. Guyuk's reply, which survives in its original Mongol text with a Persian translation, is one of the great historical documents of the medieval period, and one of the most remarkable exercises in diplomatic insult. Guyuk informed the Pope that if he truly desired peace, he should come to Mongolia personally, along with all his king, to submit to Mongol authority. God, Guyuk explained, had given dominion over all the earth to the Mongols. The Pope was simply mistaken about, had been appointed to rule the world. John of Plano Carpini returned to Europe with his life, and with a written account of his journey that remains one of the most important European ethnographic documents of the medieval period. The first detailed European description of Mongol culture, government, military tactics, and religious beliefs. It was studied carefully by subsequent travelers and diplomats, and it established a tradition of European engagement with Central Asia that would eventually, through Marco Polo and others, connect the medieval European and Chinese worlds in ways that shaped both. Chapter 10. The cathedral as cosmos, sacrament, architecture, and its secrets. A medieval cathedral was not simply a building, it was an argument. Every element of its design, from the orientation of the nave to the iconography of its portals, from the height of its vaults to the color of its windows, was chosen to express a specific set of theological and cosmological ideas. To enter a Gothic cathedral in the 12th or 13th century was to enter a representation of the universe as medieval Christian theology understood it, made visible in stone and glass. This is not a mass, not metaphor. Medieval architects and theologians ex-theology understood their churches in these terms. The great Suger of Saint-Denis, who supervised the rebuilding of the Royal Abbey Church north of Paris in the 1930s and 1940s, a project that effectively invented the Gothic style, wrote at length about the theological intentions behind his architectural choices. The light flooding through the stained glass windows was not merely decorative. It was, in Suger's theology, an image of divine illumination. The light God sheds on the intellect, making spiritual truth visible to the understanding. Suger was drawing on a mystical theology associated with a Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite, a 6th century Syrian writer, whose works, understood in the Middle Ages to be those of a 1st century Athenian convert of St. Paul. Pseudo-Dionysius taught that the physical world was a hierarchy of symbols pointing upward toward the divine light that was God's fundamental nature. The physical beauty of a church, in this theology, was not an end in itself, but a means, a ladder of light and beauty that could lift the soul toward the spiritual beauty of which all physical beauty was a shadow. This theological framework gave medieval architects a vocabulary of cosmic meaning that they embedded in every aspect of their buildings. The east-west orientation of the nave, with the altar in the east, where the sun rises, represent the movement of the soul from darkness toward the light of Christ. The crossing, the intersection of nave and transept, formed a cross, the central symbol of salvation. The height of the vaults always pushed higher, further from the earth, further toward heaven, expressed the soul's aspiration toward transcendence. Research has added new dimensions to our understanding of medieval sacred architecture. Archaeoastronomical analysis, the study of the relationships between textural orientations and slantations and celestial phenomena, has revealed that many medieval churches were oriented not simply to the east in general, but to specific points on the eastern horizon where the sun rose on the feast day of the churches in St. A church dedicated to the Nativity of the Virgin, for example, might be oriented to the point where the sun rose on September 8th, the traditional feast of the Virgin's birth. This precision of orientation required careful astronomical observation before building began, and embedded the liturgical calendar into the physical structure of the building. Even more striking is new evidence for the use of light as a liturgical instrument. At specific times of year, solstices, equinoxes, major feast days, the sun enters certain medieval churches at angles carefully calculated to illuminate specific features. An altar, a reliquary, a carved image, at the Romanesque church of Saint-Hilaire-le-Grand in Poitiers, France, analysis has shown that the nave is oriented on the winter solstice, at the moment of the celebration of the canonical hour of terce and the morning. The rising sun aligns with the church axis and floods the interior with horizontal light that travels directly to the high altar. This cannot be accidental. The construction of these buildings was itself understood as a sacred act. The master builders who designed them, the mastri latimorum, the master stonecutters, occupied a distinctive social position that combined the practical with the spiritual. They were simultaneously craftsmen and intellectuals, working with their hands and with sophisticated geometrical knowledge that had strong connections to the philosophical and theological traditions of their time. Recent research into the sociological profile of medieval master builders challenged the old image of the anonymous craftsman and absorbed into a collective enterprise. Many master builders, particularly from the 12th century onward, were named, celebrated, and remembered. They signed their work, sometimes literally carving their names or their portraits into inconspicuous corners of their buildings. They moved between projects across national boundaries, carrying their expertise and their geometrical knowledge with them. They formed something resembling a professional identity, complete with shared technical vocabulary, professional secrets, and, if later tradition is to be believed, mutual recognition symbols. This last point leads to one of the most contested questions in medieval architectural history: the relationship between medieval Masons' lodges and the later institution of Freemasonry. The claim that modern Freemasonry is a direct continuation of medieval stonemasons organizations, is foundational in all myths of Masonic tradition. Historians have been skeptical of this claim. Fisk claims the evidence for direct institutional continuity is thin. The Masonic rituals and symbols that appear in the 17th and 8th centuries do not closely match the documented practices of medieval Masons. And yet the question is not entirely settled. Recent archival work in English and Scottish Guild records has identified some intriguing continuities between late medieval Masons and organizations and early documented Masonic lodges. Continuities of terminology, of organizational structure, and of certain ritual elements. The continuity is not the direct descent that Masonic tradition claims, but it may be real enough to suggest that early Freemasonry drew on a genuine, if transformed and elaborated, tradition of medieval craft organization. The cathedrals themselves remain, physically, the most vivid records of the medieval cognitive world. Chartres Cathedral, rising above the flat agricultural land of the Bois-Plateau, southwest of Paris, rebuilt after a devastating fire in L194 with a speed and an ambition that astonishes modern observers. Within 30 years, a building of almost incomprehensible scale and complexity had been erected, of 130 meters long, with towers reaching 112 meters, 176 stained glass windows covering over 2,000 square meters of glass surface, and sculptural programs on 3 pre-portals that constitute a comprehensive visual encyclopedia of medieval theology. Chartres was and remains one of the greatest single artistic achievements of the medieval world. And, despite centuries of scholarship, it continues to reveal new secrets. Recent infrared analysis of the sculptural programs has revealed traces of original polychrome paint. Paint that was applied to the stone figures when the cathedral was new and has been almost entirely eroded by 8 centuries of weather. In their original state, the Chartres Pal sculptures were not the pale gray stone we see today, but vividly colored figures that would have created an entirely different visual effect. The medieval cathedral we see is a bleached skeleton of the living thing it once was. Chapter 11. The Silk Wood and the Medieval Global Economy. In 22717, archaeologists excavating a medieval site in Siberia discovered something thin as them cold, fragments of silk woven with patterns that exactly matched textiles documented in contemporary sources from Song Dynasty China. The site was in the foothills of the Altai Mountains, thousands of kilometers from China, and it dated to the 12th century. The silk traveled, by some route, across what is now Russia to reach a community in Siberia that, by all standard historical accounts, should have had no connection to Chinese luxury trade. This discovery is just one of hundreds made in the past 2 decades that have forced historians to fundamentally revise their understanding of the medieval global economy. The world of the Middle Ages, we used to think, was essentially local. Most people lived and died within a few kilometers of their birthplace, trading within small regional markets, entirely cut off from the wider currents of global commerce. This picture is wrong in almost every particular. The Silk Road, that famous network of overland trade routes connecting China, Central Asia, Persia, and the Mediterranean, was not a single road, but a complex webs of routes that shifted constantly with political conditions, and it carried not just silk, but an enormous variety of goods, ideas, diseases, and in both directions. Chinese porcelain found its way to medieval English manor houses. European silver coins have been excavated from medieval Central Asian sites. Indian spices flavored the food of medieval French courts. Viking traders carried Arabic silver dirhams deep into Scandinavia and eventually back south through Russia to the Black Sea. The maritime dimension of this global economy is even more striking. Medieval Arab merchants, the successors of a seafaring tradition that went back centuries, braided regular trade networks connecting the Persian Gulf and Red Sea ports to the coasts of East Africa, India, Ceylon, and Southeast Asia. Chinese junks sailed as far as East Africa in the early 15th century. During the famous voyages of the eunuch Admiral Zheng He, the Indian Ocean was, in the Middle Ages, a busy and international highway and the port cities around its rim. Then, Calicut, Malacca, Guangzhou were cosmopolitans where merchants from dozens of cultures and linguistic backgrounds traded, negotiated, and coexisted. New underwater archaeological discoveries have begun to fill in the physical details of this maritime trade. The sea floors of the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, and the Mediterranean are scattered with medieval shipwrecks that have been found, and in some cases, excavated, in recent decades. Each wreck is a time capsule, a preserved moment in the life of the medieval global economy, with its cargo intact and its manifest, sometimes recoverable from waterlogged documents. The Belitung wreck, discovered off the Indonesian island of Belitung 989-98, is particularly remarkable. The ship itself was an Arab dhow, its hull constructed in the traditional Sun plank technique of the Gulf, but its cargo was almost entirely Chinese. More than 60,000 pieces of Tang Dynasty ceramics, packed full storage patterns for a journey from a Chinese port to the Middle East that would have taken months. The wreck dates to the 9th century, technically early medieval, and it demonstrates that this trade, which we used to think of as primarily a feature of the later Middle Ages, was already operating at industrial scale in the centuries following the fall of Rome. The mechanisms by which this trade was financed are themselves a revelation. Medieval Islamic merchants developed independently and earlier than their European counterparts sophisticated financial instruments, letters of credit, partnerships, and forms of insurance that made long-distance trade feasible without the physical transport of enormous quantities of coin. A merchant in Basra, could issue a written document that would be honored by his trading partner's agent in Guangzhou, enabling commercial transactions across thousands of kilometers without moving metal. This is recognizably the ancestor of modern banking, and it was operating in the Islamic world centuries before comparable systems appeared in Europe. The Jewish trading network, known as the Radhanites, offers another window into the complexity of medieval global commerce, active from roughly the 8th to the 11th century. The Radhanites were Jewish merchants who specialized in trading between the Christian West and East and the Islamic East, a position that their religious identity uniquely equipped them. 4. Since they were accepted as trading partners by both Muslim and Christian merchants who regarded each other with suspicion, Radhanite trading routes connected France and Spain to Persia and China, carrying spices, silk, furs, swords, and slaves in both directions. The Radhanites are known primarily from a single Arabic source. The account of the geographer Ibn Khaldun, writing around 870 CE, which describes their routes in detail. For a long time, historians debated whether the Radhanites were a real commercial organization or a literary construction. Recent archaeological and archival research has substantially strengthened the case for their historical reality, identifying material evidence for Jewish merchant communities, key points along the routes that Ibn Khaldun describes. What all of this reveals is that the medieval world was far more globalized, in the sense of being connected across vast distances by commercial, cultural, and informational networks than the traditional picture allows. The Black Death traveled along these networks. So did mathematical knowledge, artistic styles, agricultural techniques, and religious ideas. The medieval world was not a collection of isolated local communities. It was a network, dense and complex and constantly shifting, that extended from the coast of China to the shores of the Atlantic. Chapter 12. The Inquisition, Truth, MYTH, and the Archaeology of Fear. Nobody expects Spanish Inquisition. So goes the famous joke. But the reality of the various medieval inquisitions is far stranger, more complex, and in some ways more disturbing than either the Protestant Reformation's demonization or the Catholic Church's subsequent defense of it would suggest. The medieval Inquisition was not a single institution. It was a collection of related but distinct judicial processes operating at different times and places, with different procedures and different levels of violence. The Inquisition, established to combat Catholicism in southern France in the early 13th century, was a different institution from the Inquisitions that operated in Germany and in Italy in the same period, which were in turn different from the Spaniards established in 478 under Ferdinand and Isabella, technically a royal institution, only loose papal oversight. Recent access to previously restricted Vatican archives has transformed historical understanding of the medieval Inquisitions. The opening of the Vatican Secret Archive, now officially renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archive, to scholars studying the Inquisition has made available vast quantities of original trial records, correspondence, and administrative documents that paint a far more detailed picture of how these institutions operated. Some of what these documents reveal challenges both of the black legend of the Inquisition as a pure instrument, fanatical terror, and the apologetic literature that tries to minimize its violence. The picture that emerges is of institutions that were, by the standards of medieval secular justice, sometimes more procedurally careful and less physically brutal than their contemporary equivalents, but that could also, under specific circumstances and with specific inquisitors, become instruments, genuine systematic terror. The Cathar Inquisition in southern France is the paradigmatic case. Also known as Albigensians, were members of a dualist-redualist movement, had spread through the towns and villages of Languedoc in the 12th century. They rejected the Catholic Church's authority, its sacraments, and much of its theology, ting instead a radical dualism in which the material world was the creation of an evil god, a ritual world was the creation of a good one. They were popular, well organized, and protected by local nobility who found them politically useful. The Albigensian Crusade, launched by Pope Innocent III in 2010, was the first crusade against a Christian heretical movement in Christian Europe. It was extraordinarily violent. The massacre at Béziers, where a crusader army reportedly killed between 7,000 and 23,000 people, Catholics and Cathars alike, is one of the most disturbing episodes in medieval history. The phrase reportedly spoken at Béziers, "Kill them all, God will recognize his own," whether or not it was actually uttered, became an emblem of the Crusades' moral character. The subsequent Inquisition into Catharism produced detailed records of Cathar communities, their beliefs, their social networks, and their practices. These records, preserved in archives in Toulouse and Rome, are one of the richest sources we have for understanding medieval popular religion, a domain that is ordinarily poorly documented because it left few written sources of its own. The inquisitors' questions and the suspects' answers give us an extraordinary window into the religious lives of medieval peasants and townspeople who rarely appear in any other kind of historical document. What these records reveal is a religious landscape far more complex and diverse than the official medieval church would have liked to believe. Alongside Orthodox Christianity and organized heretical movements like Catharism, medieval people maintained vast repertoire of local beliefs and practices, charms, healing rituals, divination, veneration of local spirits and sacred places that drew on pre-Christian traditions, folk Christianity, and sometimes on classical and Islamic learning that had percolated down through the social hierarchy. The late medieval Inquisition's engagement with witchcraft beliefs represents one of the most studied and most debated episodes in medieval history, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, published at Edi Kisten 486 by the Dominican inquisitors Heinrich Kramer, Jacob Sprenger, became the standard manual for witch hunters across Europe. Its vision of a vast, organized conspiracy of witches in league with the devil to destroy Christians' civilization has no basis in historical reality. But it shaped the witch trial epidemic of the 16th, and 17th centuries, producing untold suffering. Recent demographic analysis of witch trial records across Europe has hailed patterns that are deeply disturbing in their consistency. The victims of witch persecution were disproportionately women, particularly older women, widows, women without male protectors, women with some degree of social independence. The witch trials were not random panics. They were systematic, and their victimisms were selected according to criteria that reflected deep anxieties, gender, sexuality, and social order, communities under stress. Understanding the Inquisitions fully requires holding two things in mind simultaneously: the genuine intellectual seriousness of the medieval theological tradition that produced them, and the genuine human suffering they caused. The inquisitors were not, in the main, sadists. They were men who sincerely believed that heresy was the most dangerous possible threat to human welfare, that it condemned souls to eternal damnation, and that therefore extraordinary measures to prevent its spread were justified. This sincere belief does not excuse what they did, but it does require us, on its own terms, before we judge it. Chapter 13. The Viking Age long sung. The Viking Age, roughly 793 to 1866, from the raid on Lindisfarne to the Battle of Hastings, has suffered more from romantic mythology than almost any other period of medieval history. In the popular imagination, Vikings are horned helmeted berserkers who existed primarily to raid monasteries and terrorize the coasts of Europe. The horned helmets are wrong. There is essentially no archaeological evidence for them. The berserker warriors existed, but they were a specific and unusual phenomenon, not typical of Norse society. And while the raiding was real and often brutal, was only one aspect of a Norse civilization of remarkable complexity and reach. The reassessment of Viking history has been ongoing for decades, but recent archaeological discoveries have accelerated it dramatically. The excavation of Norse settlements in North America, the land the Norse sagas describe as being in the west, across the ocean, has moved from the realm of controversy to established fact. The site at Lance O Meadows in Newfoundland, discovered in 1960 and excavated over subsequent decades, provides unambiguous evidence of a Norse presence in North America around 1000 CEE, 5 centuries before Columbus. But Lance O Meadows may not be the only North American Norse site. Recent research using satellite imagery and aerial photogrammetry has identified potential Norse archaeological signatures at other locations in northeastern North America, and excavations are ongoing. The extent of Norse activity in North America, how long they stayed, how far they ranged, how extensively they interacted with indigenous populations, is one of the most actively contested questions in North American archaeology. The sagas themselves, long treated with skepticism as primarily literary documents, have been vindicated in significant ways by the archaeological evidence. The descriptions of landscape, resources, and indigenous peoples in the Vinland sagas corresponds. Tompt der features of Achthuster northern North American geography in ways that argue for genuine geographical knowledge as the basis of the narratives, even if the narratives themselves contain legendary elaborations. The Norse expansion in the other direction, eastward, through Russia and down the river systems to the Black Sea and Caspian, has been illuminated by remarkable recent discoveries. The Swedish Vikings who traveled east, known to the Slavic populations they encountered as the Rus, founded or captured trading centers along the Russian river network that became the nuclei of the earliest Russian towns. Novgorod, Kiev, and a dozen other cities with roots in the Viking Age have been the subjects of intensive recent archaeological excavation. The Novgorod excavations have particularly productive because of the unusual preservation conditions of the site. Novgorod sits on waterlogged soil that has preserved organic materials, wood, leather, textiles, and crucially, birch bark documents in extraordinary condition. Hundreds of birch bark letters from the 10th, 5th centuries have from Novgorod's and soils, providing an intimate documentary record of medieval Russian urban life that has no parallel anywhere else in Europe. These letters record commercial transactions, legal disputes, love affairs, and everyday concerns of merchants, craftspeople, and airy townspeople, voices from the medieval world that would otherwise be entirely silent. The Norse settlement of Iceland and Greenland raises questions of environmental history that have become newly urgent in the age of colonized Iceland. The colonized Iceland around 870 CE, Greenland around 985 CE. They farmed in Greenland for roughly 5 centuries before the Greenlandic Norse communities collapsed and disappeared sometime in the early 15th century. Why did the Greenland Norse disappear? This question has been debated for decades, with proposed answers ranging from climate change to epidemic disease to starvation to cultural rigidity. Recent research has clarified the picture considerably. Paleoclimatic analysis of Greenland ice cores and Scandinavian tree rings confirms that the period from approximately Betir to Tennefiler 450 was significantly colder than preceding and sating centuries. A phase of climate deterioration known as the onset of the Little Ice Age. This cooling would have dramatically reduced the productivity of Greenland's pastoral agriculture. But climate alone does not explain the collapse. The Greenland Norse neighbors, the Inuit, survived the same climate change because they had adapted maritime hunting technologies that allowed them to subsist on marine mammals even in severe cold. The Norse, despite 5 centuries in Greenland, apparently never fully adopted these techniques, continuing to rely primarily on the pastoral agriculture they had brought from Scandinavia and Iceland. Why they maintained this cultural commit to farming in an environment increasingly hostile to it is a question. The question that something profound about the relationship between cultural identity and survival. The most recent analysis suggests that the Greenland Norse did not simply starve. The isotopic analysis of bones from the final phases of Greenlandic Norse settlement shows an increasingly marine diet. More seal and fish, less domesticated animal, suggesting that they were adapting, but perhaps not fast enough. The end was probably a combination of factors: climate deterioration, loss of trading connections with Europe, conflict with the expanding Inuit populations, and the demographic catastrophe of the Black Death, which appears to have reached Greenland by the mid-14th century. The disappearance of the Greenland Norse is a cautionary tale about the limits of flexibility, about what happens when the environment changes faster than the cultural adaptation mechanisms of a settled population can follow. It is a medieval story with very modern implications. Chapter 10: Medicine, Magics, and Body in the Middle Ages. A patient in a medieval hospital was not in a modern medical facility in a primitive form. They were in a fundamentally different kind of institution, operating according to a fundamentally different set of assumptions about the nature of disease, the mechanism of healing, and the relationship between body, soul, and cosmos. Understanding medieval medicine requires, once again, the willingness to set aside modern categories and try to inhabit a different cognitive world. Medieval medicine was built on the ancient Galenic tradition, transmitted through Arabic scholarship and the great medieval medical schools, Salerno, Montpellier, Bologna. The Galenic system understood health as a state of balance among four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, each corresponding to particular elemental qualities and to particular emotional and physical characteristics. Disease was an imbalance of these humors, caused by constitutional factors, diet, climate, emotional states, or the influence of the stars. This theoretical framework was wrong in ways that had sometimes fatal consequences. Bleeding, the removal of blood to correct an excess of the sanguine humor, was a standard treatment for conditions that modern medicine would recognize as inflammatory diseases, where blood loss is the last thing a patient needs. Purging and vomiting, used to eliminate supposed excess humors, could and did kill patients weakened by end. And yet, recent scholarship has revealed that medieval medical practice was considerably more sophisticated in its empirical dimensions than the theoretical framework would suggest. Medieval physicians were careful clinical observers. They documented the progression of diseases with considerable accuracy, tracked treatment outcomes, and adjusted their practices based on experience, even when they could not revise their theoretical framework to explain why certain approaches worked and others did not. Analysis of medieval pharmacy and herbalism has produced some of the most striking recent discoveries in the field of medieval history. A collaboration between historians and microbiologists at the University of Nottingham undertook to test a selection of recipes from a 10th century English medical manuscript known as Bald's Leech Book, applying the preparations described and testing their effectiveness against bacteria in laboratory conditions. The results were startling. One preparation, a mixture of garlic, onion or leek, wine, and ox bile, combined in a brass vessel and allowed to stand for 9 nights, proved highly effective against Staphylococcus aureus fields, including drug-resistant MRSA strains. The ingredients, analyzed individually, do not explain the antibacterial effect. It requires the specific combination and preparation described in the manuscript. In other words, the Bald's Leech Book recipe aimed empirical knowledge accumulated through centuries of practical medical experience that genuinely worked. This finding is not isolated. Analysis of other medieval herbal preparations has found effective antiparasitic, antifungal, and antimicrobial agents in recipes that, on their surface, look like superstition. Medieval herbalists did not know about germ theory. They could not explain why their preparations worked in terms would make sense to a modern pharmacologist, but through centuries of trial and error, observing which preparations helped patients recover and which did not. They had identified combinations of plant materials with genuine therapeutic value. The surgical tradition of the Middle Ages has been similarly reassessed. Medieval surgery has long been caricatured as butchery performed by ignorant barbers. The reality was more complex. By the 13th and 14th centuries, a tradition of learned surgical practice had developed at the medical schools of Bologna, Montpellier, and Paris that it was based on medical knowledge, systematic clinical observation, a growing corpus of surgical texts. Medieval surgeons performed operations including cataract surgery, hernia repair, and the removal of bladder stones that required genuine anatomical knowledge and technical skill. Forensic analysis of medieval skeletal remains has confirmed that medieval surgery could be successful. Excavated skeletons show evidence of surgical interventions that resulted in long-term survival. Amputations, trepanations, drilling holes in the skull, and even some forms of limb reattachment that show bone remodeling consistent with healing after traumatic injury and apparent surgical treat. These were people who survived procedures that medieval surgery was supposedly incapable of performing. The relationship between medieval medicine and magic is more complex than the simple opposition, rational medicine versus irrational superstition, that older scholarship imposed. Medieval practitioners did not clearly separate what we would call medicine from what we would call magic. Charms, cures, the use of relics, and astrological timing were not alternatives to herbalism and surgery. They were complements, elements of a unified therapeutic approach rooted in the understanding that disease was simultaneously physical, spiritual, and cosmological in its causes and its cure. A headache, in the medieval understanding, be caused by an excess of blood in the glennic sense, but it might also be caused by spiritual forces, demonic influence, the evil eye, divine punishment for sin. A treatment that addressed only one of these potential causes was incomplete. An effective medieval healer needed to address all of them simultaneously, using the full range of available therapeutic technologies. Integration of the physical and spiritual is not simply ignorance or confusion. It reflects a coherent understanding of the human person as an entity that exists thus simultaneously in multiple registers: bodily, emotional, spiritual, cosmological. And that illness therefore necessarily involves all of these registers at once. Modern medicine, which increasingly recognizes the connections between mental state, social environment, physical health, is in some ways rediscovering dimensions of the human condition that the medieval medicine never lost sight of. Chapter 50 Ian. The end of the Middle Ages died, and what survived? There is no single moment when then the Middle Ages ended. Like all historical periodizations, the transition from the medieval to early modern is a gradual process, differently timed in different places, involving the accumulation of changes that only in retrospect can be seen as constituting a fundamental transformation. The traditional markers, the fall of Constantinople in 4453, the invention of the printing press around Horn 40 or Columfier 40, Columbus's arrival in the Americas in 492, the Protestant Reformation beginning in 1517, are real events with real consequences. But they do not mark a sudden rupture. The Renaissance was not an escape from the Middle Ages. It was, in many ways, a medieval project. The project of recovering and restoring ancient knowledge that medieval scholars had been pursuing for centuries, finally achieving a critical mass of recovered texts and scholarly infrastructure that transformed the enterprise. Similarly, the Protestant Reformation was not an abandonment of medieval Christianity. It was an intensification of medieval spiritual anxieties about the relationship between grace and works, about the authority of Scripture versus tradition, about the gap between the institutional church and the ideals of Christian life that had been circulating medieval reform movements for centuries. Wycliffe and Huss anticipated Luther. The Devotio Moderna anticipated Calvin. The Reformation was medieval Christianity finally fracturing under the weight of its own internal tensions. What actually ended with the Middle Ages was not the substance of medieval life, but the particular framework. The particular a way of organizing and understanding experience that had given that life its distinctive character. The cosmological framework in which the physical world was a symbolic text written by God, in which history was a sacred narrative moving toward a divine conclusion, in which human community was embedded in a hierarchy reflecting the divine order. This framework did not survive the combined impact of the printing press, the Reformation, the scientific revolution, and the global expansion of European power. What survived was everything else. Medieval legal concepts survived in the common law systems of England and the countries it colonized. Medieval university structures survived in the organization of Oxford, Cambridge, and the dozens of institutions modeled on them. Medieval political concepts. Representation, constitutional limitation. The idea that power must be accountable to law as the foundations of modern democratic thought. Medieval economic institutions, partnerships, letters of credit, double-entry bookkeeping survive as the ancestors of modern finance. Medieval architectural forms survive in churches and courthouses and universities across the Western world. And medieval questions survive, the questions that drove the best minds of the Middle Ages. How should power be exercised justly? What is the relationship between the individual and the community? How do we know what we know? What do we owe to the dead and the not yet born? How do we build communities that survive across generations? These are medieval questions. They are also our questions. And we are no closer to answering them than Hildegard of Bingen, or Verrose, or Thomas Aquinas. The newly discovered mysteries of the Middle Ages. The mysteries Bruce has explored over these 4 hours are not simply puzzles from the past. They are mirrors in which we can see our own assumptions more clearly. When we discover that medieval engineers built cathedrals without calculus, we discover something about the limits of our assumption that knowledge take a particular form to be valid. When we recover the voices of medieval women who argued for their own dignity and capability, we discover something about the persistence of certain struggles across centuries. When we learn that the Black Death reshaped the human genome, we discover something about the ways in which haptastry and recovery are woven together in the deepest of human biology. The Middle Ages are not over. They are buried in us, in our institutions, our languages, our architecture, our genomes. Every time we walk through a Gothic arch, every time we use a word borrowed from Norman French, every time follow a legal procedure that traces its lineage to a medieval court, we are living inside the medieval world's long afterlife. Understanding that world, recovering its complexity, its sophistication, its darkness, and its remarkable creativity, is not an antiquarian exercise. It is an act of self-knowledge. It is the recognition that we ought not the first to face the questions that keep us awake at night, and that who faced them before us in their strange and illuminated world have left us resources barely begun to use. The Middle Ages ended, but what they built is still standing. And in the stones, the manuscripts, the bones, and the soil, they are still speaking. We are only just beginning to listen.